We got some rather dire news recently that global carbon emissions increased by about 3% in 2018, or projected increase by about 3% in 2018. And this is on top of an increase of about 2% in 2017. And why this is really worrisome is for a couple reasons. One is that for a while there, we thought we might have seen peak global emissions. Global emissions were flat in 2014, 2015, 2016, and it raised the hopes for a lot of people that we had finally turned a corner and changed from increasing emissions every year to finally decreasing emissions. Unfortunately, those hopes were dashed by the data we got last year, and then definitely by the data we got this year, where there's even a bigger increase in emissions. This big increase in emissions was driven primarily by China, which saw a 4.5% increase, but also by the United States, which after many years of declining emissions saw a 2.5% increase in our emissions. The United States is a bit of a complicated case because despite the fact that our emissions increased this year, we also had a banner year for coal retirements and reduction in coal generation. And the electricity sector U.S. emissions were down. But the reason why U.S. emissions increased overall this year was primarily due to the combination of an unusually cold winter in some parts of the country and a very hot summer, both of which drove up energy use relative to previous years. So the U.S. seems to have been a bit of a fluke, and we expect emissions to start declining again next year. But certainly they're declining at a much slower rate than would be needed to meet any of the climate targets that the world has agreed to. The Chinese government had committed to reducing the pipeline of new coal plants. And there's been some evidence from people using satellite observations and other things that a number of coal plants that the government said would not be built are actually being built. And some of this might be local and regional governments, going behind the back of the central government. It's really hard to tell what exactly is driving these things. But there's a worrying sign that what we thought was a good sign of China reducing the amount of coal plants in the pipeline might be reversing itself a little bit. It's also unclear the extent to which the Chinese government takes climate really seriously. Like, they are a leader in renewable energy. They have the biggest installations of wind and solar in the world. And it is clear that they're trying to position themselves to be a major, if not the major player in selling these sort of technologies to other countries. So that's good. But in terms of how dedicated they are to actually reducing their domestic emissions is still an open question. And their targets that they agreed to in the context of the Paris Agreement were primarily around the emission intensity of their economy, not the total amount of emissions. And they can argue with some justification that they're ahead on meeting those targets. But the targets they've set, like the targets that most countries have set, are woefully insufficient to actually limit warming to below 2 degrees, not to mention 1.5 degrees. There's a huge and widening gap between the commitments the countries have made and the pathway we'd have to be on if we were to achieve these targets.